Okay. All right. Taking us a little bit of time to get here, but we're finally ready to go. Continuing through 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And so you're saying that you already had some questions about verse 19, but we'll get there when we get there. But when we're considering the section, we're looking at information that Paul is giving to these brethren. He's answering direct questions that they had written to him previously, and that dealing with situations of marriage. What do they need to do between those that are married, say Jews that are married to, well, Gentiles, but even as we're considering what's going to be mentioned in this next section, he's going to establish that in fact circumcision is nothing, uncircumcision is nothing. So there again, you have a connecting theme between Corinthians and also the book of Galatians, and also in the discussion that he's going to have in the book of Romans. So when we're going through all of this, we're seeing that a large battle that is being fought during this time frame is over the matter of the Mosaic system and the Mosaic law. Now, we can actually view that as a great burden that is lifted off of us, because that's not anything we have any type of connection with. We're not going up against any of these type of battles where people are trying to bring Judaism in, but the application is still there, because even though they're not trying to bring Judaism in, they're bringing in all other manner of foolishness and different things that are not needing to be brought into the Lord's church, into the Lord's body. So verse 17, where we were starting to get into last week, but as God hath distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called everyone, so let him walk. And so ordain I in all the churches. So this is being said from the context of, what are we to do with these marriages? What is best to take place in the midst of this present distress that we find ourselves in? And Paul sums all of it up to say, listen, whatever you're in when you obey the gospel, that's where you need to stay. He's already said previously that the husband, the wife, they're not to leave one another. They are not to defraud one another, except to be with consent and for a brief moment of time. And if they do separate, he ends up saying, you need to be reconciled back to each other. And that if the unbelieving ends up departing, then you just let them go. You're not needing to hold on to your marriage relationship, and so end up rejecting and refusing the position that you have being in Christ. So when we're seeing that this is being presented, we're being presented with this picture. Here are the people. Jew, Gentiles, they become Christians. But even as we're going to state further in this section, we're going to get into the matter of slavery. And Paul, this is even in this section, right? This verse right here, verse 17, is opening that section. Even when it comes to one being a slave, Paul is saying, and he's encouraging, as the Lord hath called everyone, so let him walk, and so ordain I in all the churches. Now, when we consider that from our standpoint, that's a pretty hard pill to swallow. And even today, in the midst of a lot of what's going on, you have a lot of people that would be, I'm sure, up in arms if Paul were to even, like say Paul were alive in the beginning stages of this country, and he comes along and he's being taught and he's teaching, and then you have those that are stolen from Africa and they're having to hear, well, you're obeying the gospel, but you're a slave, just stay a slave. Now the problem with that is, well, let me just ask, what is the problem with that? With what people today are thinking about slavery?
Well, slavery back then in the Bible times was different. It was more about indentured servitude. And then after a certain time, didn't they in the Jubilee year have to let them go?
Right.
So it was for a specified time. And it wasn't slave, like you're a subpar person,
okay,
and you must remain such for the rest of your life.
Okay.
Would you call it the slavery?
Indentured servitude.
All right, so Jamie hit it right on the head. People are wanting to view the situation of slavery just from what has been transpiring within the last, I don't know what, 200 years. What was it? You know it exactly?
Well, it's 243 years.
Okay.
America.
Since America.
44 this year. Sorry.
So they're wanting to view everything from the standpoint of what transpired in this country. And that's not a proper way to do your study, because our country is relatively young compared to the rest of the world. And then you have on top of that just Europeans, Asians, people in India. They were involved in the slave trade long before this country was ever thought of.
What countries?
Europe, Asia, and even in India, to a degree, that's still going on today. And for that matter, even in Africa, you still have tribes going and warring with other tribes, and they're taking these people from their tribes and making them slaves. So let me say from the start that the Bible nowhere condones slavery as practiced in America. The Bible is very clear against men stealing. And that's exactly what was taking place in Africa and bringing Africans over to this country. Going over into their different tribes, stealing them, and then putting them into service. And then on top of that, as James said, Israel had slaves, but they were not made slaves because they were viewed as a lesser species. And that was the problem that was going on inside of this country, was you had the white Americans that were here, and they were promoting and propagating that this is just the natural state of those that have black skin because they are lesser than us. They're subhuman. And even when they granted the slaves their freedom at first, if you can even call it freedom, it wasn't full freedom. They, with the different ones that were allowed to vote, they weren't even given a full vote. Because even then, our government and different ones inside of the government were saying, well, they're not at the full level as a white person is. The Bible nowhere teaches that, nor does it condone it. But at the same time, throughout the Old Testament, Israel did have slaves. The reason for that is because, it's no different than when our country goes in and occupies another country in a time of war. They may still have some remnants of their former government, but who's in charge?
God.
Well, God is, but I'm saying when we go in and occupy another country, who's in charge? We are. You've got to listen to us. And even then, that's just for a time until we can get you set up to where you're needing to be. So we still have some of this that goes on. You go out, you make war, you conquer another country, they become subservient to you. They pay taxes, they pay all these different things going back to the children of Israel. Now, when we're considering why God had the children of Israel going in and taking captive these other lands, we said it's not because they're being viewed as a lesser species. Why were they being overtaken?
They were sinning.
All right, they were a wicked people. So even, it's like, you take, for example, the colonialists coming over to this country, and they end up going to war with the tribes. What would the tribes be involved in? Idolatry, paganism. And granted, white people can be just as cruel, but Indians, different tribes, warring tribes, they're not being very kind to one another. So it's just like, what's the big deal here? It's just a matter of somebody stronger came along and took what you had. That's the way it goes. We could end up finding ourselves in a similar situation with how China is continuing to develop, to where we end up finding ourselves being overtaken. The only difference is that they have direct statements to go and be involved in things or to not be involved in things, whereas we have to try to make wise decisions and proper judgment on what's actually going to be best. So I said on the start, we're not looking at this from the standpoint of this is what's going on in America. There's nothing to compare with what's transpiring here, and even with what Paul is going to be discussing. To also throw in there for your notes, Exodus chapter 22 and verse 21, Exodus 23 and verse 9. Those are specific laws given by God through Moses on how the children of Israel were to treat strangers. Thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. So you see, even right there, God is bringing to their remembrance, listen, when you take these people over and you start bringing them in, and you have the stranger and you have servants and you have slaves, you remember how you were treated when you were a slave. So even there's a regulation going on that you cannot just treat these people any type of way that you want to just because they're a slave. Because the ultimate goal is to have them come under the system that you are under and to have them proselyte in as well. Even in the book of Exodus, you have it being said that a stranger would be able to partake of the Passover. They have to be circumcised, but you see, the situation is going to be so good for them that they're going to be willing to convert. Because just, okay, I see the righteousness that's with this people. I see the righteousness that's with the God that they serve, and I want to be a part of this. But you're a slave. Well, that doesn't matter. I'm being treated so well, even as a slave. So as we're moving forward, that's what's going to be viewed here. So number 2 in all of this, he says to be content in that, and nowhere does Paul encourage a social revolution. Now that's interesting, considering how it is that a lot of our, politics and different things are based around, this type of thing. But even as we are seeing in our present day and age, just going out and causing revolution, does that really bring about proper change? All right, not all the time. Now, if you're going in like our founding fathers did in that revolution, where it's just like, okay, we're actually having to take life, then that's one thing. But if what we're actually trying to do is trying to produce these changes within society, it's not a thing of just getting mad and going out and rioting and, all these different things. As we said, we've got to be involved in changing people's minds if we're really going to bring about a proper change. So the question that Paul is presenting, and that he's trying to help them to realize, and then even for us today, that he's trying to help us to realize, the question is, can I serve God in this situation? If so, then Paul says, stay in it. If you're a slave, don't seek your freedom. If you're able to serve God. If you're married and you're able to serve God, then don't seek to be loose from it. If you're single and you can contain, you're single, virgin, or a widow, and you can contain and you're able to stay in this state so that you can continue to serve God, then do that. Now, he is going to say, unless an opportunity is given to better oneself with freedom, then yes, take that. That is the, we're able to take that so that we're able to serve God better. But that is the primary purpose and focus of life. Is that if I am in a situation to where I'm being taken care of, and at the same time I'm able to serve God, then fine, I'll stay in it. But if this ends up turning into a situation to where I'm not able to serve God as I should, then I need to start making some changes. And even so then there's another letter written to Philemon. And Philemon is all about how that Philemon has had a slave run away. He's come into contact with Paul. Paul converts Philemon, and Philemon stays with him for a little while and helps him out. But then Paul finally ends up saying, but I realize that Philemon needs to go back. Or excuse me, not Philemon, Onesimus is needing to go back. Because he's obligated to Philemon. And in that letter, and even in this section here, Paul is going to, without really coming out and saying it, he's going to encourage Philemon to give Onesimus his freedom. Because Philemon is a brother, now Onesimus is a brother. And it's just, if you're now both Christians and realizing the responsibility that each one has to one another, then set him free. And let him fulfill his responsibility that he has to as a free man and not as a slave. So verse 18 and 19. Is any man called being circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Is any called in uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised. So here's part of the problems that we're facing. Any called being circumcised? Well, don't start hating on the fact that you're circumcised. Don't start viewing that as anything. If you're uncircumcised, then okay, don't worry about it. Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but the keeping of the commandments of God. It does not matter about what's going on the outside. So right here, we have the gospel breaking down racial barriers. What normally would be a wall between Jew and Gentile, and that's what Galatians and Ephesians is also talking about, Colossians for that matter as well. What would be a dividing mark between these classes of people is that we have one class over here and there's another class over here. All of that's being removed to where anybody is able to come in. These things do not matter. Rich, poor, white, black, male, female, bond or free, none of that matters. You're able to obey the gospel no matter where it is that you stand. Circumcision is nothing. So as we said, we're addressing the overall problem. Judaizing teachers coming in, trying to implement the law of Moses into this. And here again, Paul is making another statement where circumcision does not matter. Be circumcised, fine. If you're not circumcised, all right. And what's really crazy about this is that even in our day and age, you still have people that lose their mind over circumcision. Like the very fact that we still have parents that are circumcising their babies, and it's just like, why? Well, it goes back to this. They know enough of the Bible that God's people were circumcised. Okay, what about a baby that's not circumcised today? It doesn't matter. So, but there still is a bit of stigma, or not necessarily stigma, but I guess tradition over the fact, well, okay, we have this son, we've got to get him circumcised. It's just like, for what? That's not even mattering anymore. So what is mattering? What is the main goal? But the keeping of the commandments of God. So you had a question about this.
It's not a question, maybe a statement. It's just the denominations nowadays that talk about us working, earning.
Right, yeah.
And this is, I mean, how do you keep the commandments if you're not doing something?
Exactly.
So you'd have to take this verse out of there to make their beliefs fit.
That's right.
That's it. I mean, I was just making an observation. It's just keeping the commandments of God. Mine has the in italics. You're right. Just those last three words is what matters in my Bible here. Yours stops at God, but mine, somebody inserted is what matters.
Huh, okay.
So this is the New King James.
Interesting. But yes, definitely. So yeah, the thought that you're having is the very same point that I was just fixing to present. Here we have supposedly the apostle of grace who is opposed to works. But here we see it's not in opposition to all works. But we have an opposition to these things that actually hold no credit, no weight anymore inside of God's system and the law of Christ. But there are certain things that we are needing to hold to. And it's just, so yeah, the very point that you're making is just, okay, Paul, why are you writing to this congregation and telling them to do stuff? Don't you know that it's not based upon anything that we do? I mean, this is the same writer of Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. For we're saved by grace through faith, not of works, not of yourselves, lest any man should boast. And yet here he is saying, but keep the commandments. How do you make those things mesh up? It's because we're separating, we're making a division between the type of works that we're supposed to be interested in. Mm-hmm. We're not worried about these issues of the flesh, circumcised, uncircumcised, but we're worried about these matters of the spirit that are building up this inner man. So here we have, the very thing that people would say about us, well, it sounds like you're working your way to heaven. Sounds like Paul is trying to work his way to heaven. Well, if you have a misunderstanding about works, then yeah, you would think that. But the fact remains, as we've already been presenting, we are already on our way to heaven. These are things that we are doing because of what it is that we are going to gain. I'm not doing these things still hoping to gain based off of what I'm doing. The hope that I have is sure. And because of that surety, then what am I going to do? I'm going to live faithfully. Just so we're in this context of a slave to a master, and we've made that connection several times. You're bought with a price, he's going to end up saying again. And so if I'm bought by somebody else, then what's my responsibility? What's my obligation? To do what my master says. And it's just that simple. We hold that same position, and in that same office. So even we're considering what these works are for, but the keeping of the commandments of God. What was circumcision for? Now, it brought them into covenant, but what was the main purpose of the covenant? Okay. We are separating this class of people so that we can follow the bloodline that the Messiah is to come through. That's all this is for. Separating the Jews from the Gentiles. That's what it does. That's it. So what about with us keeping the commandments?
Separates us from the world.
It separates us from the world. These are the identifying marks of who God's people are and who his servants are. So, here is one situation in life. When he or she obeys the gospel, what will he do in his situation? Here's the instruction. If you can obey the Lord being a slave, then be obedient. But if you need to be free to serve God, then seek it. That's the instruction. Don't try to go out, start revolts. He says in verse 20, let every man abide in the same calling wherein he is called, circumcision, uncircumcision, married, widowed, single, slave. Art thou called being a servant? Now, notice this. Care not for it. But if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. That is a difficult thing for me to wrap my head around. Because I'm an American.
Mm-hmm.
I've got rights. We're all about freedom and liberty. But the problem is that freedom and liberty are very fragile things, as we are seeing, to where they can be taken away. Whether it's by our own country, our own countrymen, or another country coming in and taking us over. The question ends up being, in being made a slave, if I'm able to serve God, and then being able to step back and just say, okay, fine. To be able to set aside my rights and to set aside my liberties. Now, as I said before, we do not have God speaking to us directly and telling us, hey, China is coming and they are my weapon of judgment. If that's God's judgment, is there any fighting against God's judgment? No. So what is it going to be better to do in that situation? I mean, it's either stay and suffer it or flee. And you see, that's the thing about it is if it came down to a situation where we're having to, say, flee America, where we're having to run into either Mexico or Canada, or we take flights across the ocean, I can be a Christian wherever I need to go. And it's being able to look at the things that are around me and just say, these things really don't matter. The homes that we build, the businesses that we establish, the relationships and different things that might hold us to this patch of dirt, ultimately are not what we're having to focus on. We are first and foremost thinking about serving God. And that's what Paul is emphasizing to this class of people. That's what you think about first. And that this is what your mind should be on. And if in this situation I can serve God, then okay, let me do it. And we have other illustrations just like this. I mean, just, in the Old Testament, you have Joseph. Why didn't Joseph try to run away?
How do we know he didn't?
Well, because it says he was obedient. Now, I would say that definitely God's hand was involved in all of that, that he would end up in Potiphar's house. And that Potiphar would treat him as well as he did. But even then, being cast into prison. That's a bit outside of anybody's parameters and territory as to how you're going to be treated and how you're going to be received. But even in prison, because Joseph had the mindset that he was going to serve God first, he gains the respect of the wardens, the keepers of the prison, to where he's put in charge of other prisoners. And because of all of that, what ends up being the end result?
Ranked up Pharaoh.
He becomes second in command. That takes a great deal of wisdom, and a lot of it is judgment call. Because I don't know what I would do if I were in that type of situation. To whether I would just stay, put up with it, or try to escape. And I guess that really is the call that you have to make is it going to be better for me? You know, how am I going to be treated? Am I going to be treated well in this man's house to where I can stay? Or do I try to escape and possibly look at being beaten and sold to somebody else? All these different things have to be brought up. And then even in the situation of the kings, where you have Naaman, before he comes to the prophet Elijah, how does he know to come to the prophet?
Servant girl.
All right. An Israelite that was enslaved. She is in Assyria or Syria. I can't remember exactly where Naaman is from at this point. But here she is being held captive, and she's just serving this family, and her master is a leper, and she tells the household, well, if he goes to Israel and finds the prophet, he can be healed. Being able to look beyond our present circumstances and being able to view the bigger picture and the greater good of it, to where we'd be able to realize, okay, if this country is overrun, okay, I get to take the gospel somewhere else. It's kind of the idea of looking for a silver lining. Yes.
I just wanted to say, with the servant girl, the other one that has always struck me that has stayed, and basically she was, in my mind, a slave too, although not stated that, was Esther. Because she remained obedient to her uncle, and then in doing so, she became the wife.
That's right.
Of who she became the wife of, and in doing so, she was able to save the nation of Israel because of the position that she was put in. But in all reality, she was just much a slave as the servant.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. So we have, continuous illustrations, and like we said, a lot of that is because God had said previously, okay, this is going to happen to you. And if God says it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And that's part of the reason why they hated the prophet Jeremiah so much, was because he was coming to Israel and telling them, you're going to be overrun, do not fight it. Well, that goes against our very instincts as a human being. Our instinct is preservation. I've got to protect my life. And even Jeremiah was warning the people, okay, some of you are going to die when this happens. But some of you are going to live. And if you will submit, it's going to be better for you than if you try to rise up and fight. Of course, they didn't want to listen, but those are the type of things that we have to start trying to weigh out. It's just kind of be able to see the writing on the wall, if you will, and it's just who's actually going to win this and who's not. And if it ends up being a situation where it's like, look, we are overtaken, I'm not fighting. And I'm going to suffer whatever ends up coming upon us, so that if some way, shape, or form, I'm able to influence somebody to have them be able to convert. Now, it's tough being able to make these type of decisions, because depending on what the day is and what's going on, I'm feeling pretty ready to take up arms based on stuff that's happening. But then again, you start thinking about it, and it's just like, well, it very well could just be that this is what our country is reaping after all the years of sowing wickedness. To where it just comes into your mind where it's like, well, would it really even be worth it to fight for it? And this happens in countries all the time. Nations rise and fall. And a new nation comes to power, and just got to deal with whatever it is that ends up coming upon us. But it's all stemming back to this being able to set aside what our personal feelings are, to then being able to say, well, I'm going to try to serve God no matter what my circumstance is, or what my circumstances are.
One of the happiest books in the Bible is Philippians, and Paul's in jail saying, yeah, I got to preach to all these people.
Right.
I hope I get to die and go to heaven, but if I get to stay alive and preach more, I guess I'll keep doing that, because he makes it happy in whatever situation he's in.
Yeah. And so even in that situation where he's in prison in Rome, that allows an opportunity for the gospel. It actually says in the book of Acts for the gospel to go into Caesar's house. And who would have ever imagined at that time frame that a Jew, which of course he's not a Jew, he's a Christian, but they're going to look at him as a Jew, that a Jew would come into the very heart, the center of Rome, and begin infiltrating. But how is he doing it? He's doing it from a prison cell. So when we start thinking about, how it is that we're going to start implementing change, oftentimes it doesn't go the way that we think.
Like praying for patience. We think that God is just going to give us patience. It just comes upon us, and then we're just patient.
Yeah.
And it doesn't. It doesn't happen. No.
Yeah, it's being able to go through it. So here we're looking at it. Here you are a slave, and Paul just says, okay, serve God. But if freedom is offered and you can be made free, then Paul says, all right, take advantage of that. But he's looking at this situation. This is not a sinful situation. You are not in sin being a slave. Your situation, your circumstance, or your relationship, none of that is sinful. If it were sinful, then the command would be to get out of it. Get out of it and stay out of it. Verse 22. For he that is called in the Lord being a servant is the Lord's free man. Likewise also he that is called being free is Christ's servant. So here is where the chickens really come home to roost. In all of this scenario, the man is a slave, becomes a Christian. Well, physically he's still a slave. But what is most important is he is free in Christ. All are servants to the Lord. And the same thing is going to be written to the church at Ephesus and at Colossae. Whatever the situation in life, use your influence for good. So here we have, Paul is addressing the matter of slavery by showing, all right, a servant is actually free when he's in the Lord. What about the person who's free? The person that's free is Christ's servant. So here you have a flipping of the roles to where Paul is trying to establish. You do not need to be looking down on these individuals that are servants, because even though you are free physically, you are somebody else's. And with that realization, that should encourage the letting loose and the establishment of the freedom of these other people. In them realizing, okay, or if nothing else, improve the relationship. In realizing that I have somebody that I'm serving, would I want my master? Do I want Jesus just mistreating me? No. So then what about these individuals that are my servants? I don't mistreat them. So we're right back in Matthew chapter 7 in verse 12. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Even that finds its application in this master-servant relationship. And there are some historians that they're saying that there would have been hundreds of thousands of slaves inside of the city of Corinth, just by itself. Now you take, for example, that here comes Paul and he's teaching this message. And what is he ultimately teaching? He's ultimately teaching that, okay, inside, really the grand scheme of things, inside of Christianity, master and slave are the same person. They're on the same level. So what about what we end up doing in economic standings or in social standings? We shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't be playing these games to where you have this class up here and, so on and so forth.
Because even a slave would have to call out a brother master
Right.
if he's sinning.
Right.
And it specifically forbids that behavior in James
Right.
to
That's right.
elevate somebody just because of their circumstances.
Right. Yeah, you see somebody with a costly apparel, they're coming in well dressed, and you say, sit here. And you see somebody else who's poor, and you say, sit here and be my footstool. Yeah, that's the kind of stuff that's not supposed to be going on, because ultimately that's not the kind of stuff that matters. Though that's what the outward man is looking at. So here's the point we're needing to see. Above everything else in this world, our aim is to serve God and to please God, no matter what our present circumstances are. Whatever the circumstances may be, or however difficult, unless it is an absolute hindrance, we are to think about serving God. And certainly, if a slave is in a position to where, the master is withholding them from being in a obedient relationship to God, then it'd be the same state like we're saying about the wife that has an unbelieving husband and he wants to leave. Okay, you don't have to honor that. You don't have to hold on to that. So even in this situation, Paul is saying, if you're serving a master and he is being so harsh on you and being cruel to you where he's not allowing you to worship and assemble and he's making you do unethical and sinful things, you don't have to stay with that man. You have more responsibility to follow after God. So here's the situation. We're not back in this situation. But if we were to put ourselves in it, Saul comes and pulls you from your home for being a Christian. What do you do?
Be a Christian.
That was the easy way out.
Logical.
Do you fight back?
That's human nature.
Well, isn't that one of your judgment calls?
It would be. And even as we're describing that, did Paul suffer every little thing that came his way?
No, he went out of the basket.
All right. So the very first place in Damascus, he obeys the gospel and he starts preaching to the town of Damascus, and they come and they're wanting to take him to jail. Paul runs. All right. So there's an option. All right. I know somebody's coming for me. I don't have to stay. Run. Another time where Paul and his traveling companions find themselves in prison and they are beaten. What does Paul do?
Is that an axe?
Mm-hmm.
Can't remember.
He brings up his Roman citizenship
Oh, I remember.
and he uses that so as to be able to get out of jail. So the idea that, okay, yeah, well, no, you just got to suffer everything that comes along. Not necessarily. And even with this persecution that that Saul is bringing on in Acts chapter 8, Acts chapter 9, what were many of the Christians doing? What they were fleeing, they were running. And ultimately, if you want to put it in our vernacular, they were running from the law. Nothing wrong with that. Because if we are in fact going to be involved in doing what God wants us to do, then I need to make sure that I'm doing what I can so to make sure that I'm in the best circumstance to go out and to help the Lord's kingdom. So so as we're saying, it just comes down to judgment call. And so even with Paul going to prison, even that was a direct bit of information and revelation that was given to him by God. The prophet comes and takes Paul's girdle or Paul's belt, ties himself up with it, and says, whoever's girdle this is what's going to happen to them. So Paul knew full well what was going to happen. So what do you do in that situation?
Follow God's plan.
Yeah, you don't fight it. We, on the other hand, do not have we don't have that advantage to where we're being told, okay, fight it this time, don't fight it this time. It just comes down to the situation of what we have to try to figure out what's going to work out best for the kingdom, not necessarily what's going to work out best for me. So that's the situation with Saul. The Romans come and they're rounding up Christians. What do? Now, I know many of them were caught and they were thrown into the Colosseum, but as we're saying, nobody said you had to stay. Take off, run, go live somewhere else. Or if you do find yourself being captured, then, like Paul said, keep to the commandments. Even down to your last dying breath. In this situation, we just continue to serve God. Whether we're on the run, whether we're in prison. Now, a point is often made, how will people die for the Lord when they will not work for him? The same question should be asked, how will people die for the Lord if they cannot become a slave for him? Would I be willing to let loose of my freedoms and my liberties and become a slave to somebody else for the cause of Christ? I don't know. It's one thing to talk about it, but until it actually happens, then I don't know.
It's kind of a weird, I don't know, my mind is going whirling around on all these things that you're saying, because America was established on people that were rebellious against the government.
Right.
And we wouldn't have our freedoms if it wasn't for that. And it seems like we should be able to fight for our freedom in order to have the liberty to teach people this. And it almost makes it sound like we're not allowed to pick up arms and fight for our freedom in order to keep this.
Mm-hmm.
So in my mind, I would fight to keep this, because in my mind, just let me see what you were saying here. People die for the Lord. I don't know. There's something weird that goes around in my mind, like you say, that how do you say that? Perseverant. What do you call it? I'm missing the word.
Self-preservation.
Preservation. There you go. It's that thing that you want to stay alive and you want to make sure that your family is safe and you want to make sure that you can still spread this gospel to other people as a free man as opposed to a slave, which they may not allow you to have a Bible. They may not allow you to have grape juice and unleavened bread and to sing and to do our worship to God like we want. So it almost feels to me that I need to fight to be able to keep that freedom to do it. So there must be something I'm missing here.
No, because I mean it's because like with the Revolutionary War, let's say things didn't play out the way they did. Let's say that we actually lost. All right, what then? It'd be the same thing. Serve the best that you can. And if you need to run, if you need to flee somewhere else so as to be able to serve God like you need to, then that's what you need to do. But I definitely, so I mean, there is a bit of difficulty in it from the standpoint of, because even though we're looking at this from this standpoint, we do have the responsibility in removing wickedness from nations. I mean, in the Old Testament, I know that we recognize that, okay, God does that, but how did God do it in the Old Testament?
Using people.
Using people. He used the children of Israel to go out and to remove wickedness. Now, why our brethren do not have that same understanding, that same idea that we have the responsibility to do that physically just as much as we do spiritually, I don't know why. Other than, I guess it's kind of similar to what Jordan and I were discussing yesterday, is that it's just a overemphasis of the mercy, compassion, loving side of God, and not really bringing out the full picture of God's wrath and God's judgment. So it is just like, it is going to be a matter of, like, in the midst of what's going on here. If there ends up being a situation where there's a call to arms so as to, try to help this country, well, I'm going to look at the lay of the land first and just figure out, well, who's actually standing up for what's right and what's wrong? And are we actually going to be able to win this? And if not, I'm not going to die for that, because that's not going to be any benefit. And what benefit is it for me to die for a piece of dirt and for me to lose the influence that I would be able to have somewhere else? Now, some can look at that as being cowardly, whatever. I don't really care. Because our first goal and our first aim is to help people go to heaven. And I can't do that dead. So that's got to be the idea of it. And even then, let's say that we end up being overtaken, and let's say it is China and they're extremely cruel to us. I don't have to stay. I don't have to stay imprisoned and stay a slave in that situation. Just go. Leave. And try to take as many people with me as I can. So even as we're looking at it, just the idea that you just got to submit and listen to whoever's in charge, you're not going to find that. Now, I know they try to do that from the book of Romans and looking at Rome and how bad they were. But as we said, God had already said that Rome was going to be a weapon of judgment. So what do you do in that situation?
Go along.
You go along. You can't fight it. The only thing you can do is use the time that you have, save as many people that you can, but judgment's going to come. Flee to the mountains. So there again, even Jesus is saying, if you have a chance to get out, get out.
Vespasian went back to Rome.
So even there, even Jesus to a degree is that not revolt within itself? Fleeing from your Roman captors? Fleeing the police? Absolutely. So yeah, it's just, certainly when we're looking at it from the standpoint of protecting your family, yeah, I'm all for that. But the idea of, that necessarily I've just got to die for my country, no, not necessarily. And that's really what got the Jews in trouble.
Well, I think the thing is too, what you're saying in this theme is that we identify so much as Americans, like we said, that we forget we're really citizens of God's family, and that comes first. And I remember there was a time when my dad was talking about a different religion, and he didn't understand how they could call themselves the religion first and not citizens of the country they were from. He didn't understand it. He was a patriot, and he loved his country, which is America. But as a Christian, that is, but it's no buts, but
However,
it, as an American, you are raised to believe in your freedoms. That's what you were taught. Well, increasingly less so, but the concept is God first, and that's what this is saying here. And
it really comes down to like a matter of standing up for right and wrong, more than just standing up for a flag. And
No, I
and
agree with that.
you know, to a large degree, that's what our flag represented, was a class